The plant foreman said it into the radio on the loading dock, loud enough that 3 men laughed before he'd even finished the sentence. Behind the fence, 16-year-old Elias Briggs never turned around. He was on his knees in the gravel of his family's empty lot, already sorting the first truckload the cannery had just dumped there, 6,000 cans, every one of them pulled off the line for a dented body, a crooked seam, or a lid that wouldn't seal. Cans the plant would rather bury than store. The foreman had made that call himself. Cheaper to dump it on the Briggs lot than pay the landfill by the ton. Let the boy figure out what to do with a mountain nobody in the county would touch. By the end of the week, the pile stood taller than the fence line, and the whole town had a new joke running at the diner counter. Trucks slowed on the county road just to look. One man rolled his window down and asked, grinning, if the boy planned on eating off that heap come winter. Elias didn't answer him. He picked up a can, turned it once under the light, checked the seam the way his grandfather used to check a jar lid before it ever went in the cellar, and set it down in a stack that was starting to look less like garbage and more like a plan. Nobody standing at that fence that week could have guessed that 18 months later, that same pile of rejected cans would be sitting on shelves in a food pantry serving 4 counties, under a contract with Elias Briggs's name on it. Before we get to how, do me a favor. If you've ever looked at something everybody else called worthless and known better, hit subscribe, because this channel is built on stories exactly like this one. Now back to that lot, 6 months before a single can ever showed up. The Briggs lot sat on the west edge of Ellerby, Georgia, 4 acres of red clay and scrub grass behind a chain-link fence that had been rusting since before Elias was born. There had been a house on it once, and there still was, technically, though the roof sagged in the middle like it was waiting on permission to fall the rest of the way down. Cornell Briggs had worked the seam inspection line at Halsey Brothers Canning Company for 33 years. Green beans, corn, tomatoes, whatever came through the plant that season, and for the first 22 of those years, the job had belonged to his hands and his eyes alone. A can came down the belt. He pressed 2 fingers against the lid, gave it a half turn, and knew inside of a second and a half whether the seal underneath was sound. Men who worked beside him for a decade never once saw him get it wrong. Then, 9 years before he died, Halsey Brothers installed a vision system, a camera and a laser, and a computer that measured every can against a profile so exact it had no patience for anything outside it. A dent the width of a fingernail on the body of the can, harmless, sealed tight, got kicked off the line the same as a can with a genuinely split seam. The machine did not know the difference between ugly and dangerous. It only knew different, and different meant reject. Cornell used to come home and tell Elias about it at the kitchen table, not bitter exactly, just tired in a specific way. That machine rejects more good cans in a day than I ever threw out in a year, he'd say, turning his coffee cup the way a man turns a thing he's decided not to fight. But it never gets tired, and it never calls in sick, and the company likes that better than it likes being right. He died in March, on a Tuesday, in the break room, with half a sandwich still on the table in front of him. His heart had been giving him trouble for longer than anybody knew because he'd never once mentioned it. Elias was 16. His mother, Yvonne, worked 2 shifts a week at the hospital laundry and picked up cleaning jobs on the weekends. His sister Toya was 9 and had just lost the only parent who'd ever taught her to ride a bike. There was no life insurance. Cornell had let the policy lapse 2 years earlier during a stretch when the company cut overtime, and he'd meant to start it back up, and there had always been something else that needed the money more that month. What there was, instead, was a funeral bill, and 4 acres of land with 3 years of back county taxes on it that Cornell had been quietly falling behind on since before Elias could remember, and a letter from the tax office with a date circled on it that fell 9 months out. Elias found that letter going through his father's dresser drawer, tucked under a stack of pay stubs, and he sat on the edge of his parents' bed for a long time holding it before he told his mother. 2 days after the funeral, a Halsey Brothers truck pulled up the gravel drive of the Briggs lot, and the foreman riding shotgun in it, a heavy-set man named Dale Prout, who'd worked with Cornell for 11 years and had stood in the back at the service without saying a word to the family, got out and looked at the 4 empty acres like he was doing math in his head. "Ma'am," he said to Yvonne, hat in his hands, "I know it's a hard time to be asking anything of you." He looked past her toward the fence line. "But we've got a reject problem out at the plant that's gotten past what the landfill wants to keep taking off our hands, not at the price they're charging now. I was wondering if you'd let us use a piece of this lot to set some of it down. We'd pay a little for the use of the ground." Yvonne looked at him a long moment. She had buried her husband 4 days earlier, and she had a tax bill in a drawer that she had not told her son the full size of yet, and a little money for the use of the ground was a little money. "How much is a little?" she asked. Dale Prout named a number. It was not generous. It was not nothing either. Yvonne looked back at the house, then at the boy standing behind her in the doorway, not saying anything, the way he'd been not saying anything since the funeral. She said yes. What Dale Prout did not explain, because nobody asked him to, was that the reject pile at the plant had grown past 6,000 cans that quarter, more than the vision system had ever kicked out in a single stretch, because a supplier had shipped a bad batch of can bodies with a seam profile just outside spec, and every one of them had failed inspection, even though most of them held a perfectly good seal. 6,000 cans of green beans and tomatoes and corn, still sealed, still good, sitting in a warehouse costing the company money by the week just to store. The first truck came on a Thursday morning in April. Elias watched it back up to the fence and tip its bed, and cans came down in a rolling clatter that didn't stop for what felt like 10 minutes, and when it finally did, there was a pile in his family's yard, higher than his waist and wider than the house. Dale Prout got out, looked at it, looked at Elias standing there in his father's old work jacket, and said into the radio clipped to his shoulder, loud enough for the 2 men still up in the truck cab to hear, "Somebody tell Cornell Briggs's boy the Cannery ain't running a charity out of his own backyard." The men laughed. Elias didn't turn around. He was already on his knees in the gravel, picking up the first can, turning it once under the morning light. Nobody in Ellerby had ever seen that much canned food sitting in one yard, and for the first week, that was mostly what the town talked about. A truck would slow on the county road, somebody would lean out and ask if the Briggs boy was building a fort, and drive off laughing before Elias had a chance to answer, which was fine, because he had no answer prepared and no interest in giving one to a truck window. What he had was his father's voice, which he had not asked to still be carrying around in his head, but which showed up anyway most mornings, while he was elbow-deep in a pile that smelled like tin and dust. "That machine rejects more good cans in a day than I ever threw out in a year." Cornell had kept a small spiral notebook in the nightstand, not a diary, more a habit, a place he'd written down the seams he'd caught over the years that the paperwork never asked about. Elias found it the same week he found the tax letter, and for a long time he didn't understand why his father had bothered. Rows of dates, a few words each, dent on body sound seal kept it off report, rim ding pulled it right call, new system flags anything past 3,000ths, machine can't feel the difference, my hands still can. There was a shorter note on the inside cover, written smaller than the rest, like it had been added later. A dent in the wrong place will kill somebody. A dent in the right place is just ugly. Most folks can't tell you which is which, and that's the whole job. Elias read it maybe 6 times before it meant anything to him. Then he went out to the pile and started sorting. He learned the categories the slow way, which is the only way anybody learns anything that matters. A can with a dent on the flat of the body, away from the top and bottom seams, was almost always fine. The metal there had given it. It could take a hit and bounce back, and the seal underneath, that tight double-rolled seam where the lid met the body, never even felt it. A can with a dent anywhere near that seam, though especially a sharp one, a corner hit instead of a broad one, was a different animal entirely. A seam dent could crack the seal in a way you couldn't always see from outside, and a cracked seal let air in, and air in a can of green beans sitting in a warehouse for weeks was how you got the kind of contamination that put people in a hospital. He didn't know the word for it yet. He'd learn it soon enough. Sitting at the library with a stack of food safety pamphlets, a librarian named Miss Odom pulled for him without being asked twice. Botulism, the reason a can that looked almost fine could still be a genuine, serious danger, and the reason grocery stores threw out Dented cans without a second thought even when most of them were perfectly good, because nobody wanted to be the one who guessed wrong. That was the whole shape of the problem, and it was the same shape his father had spent 33 years standing inside of. The company wasn't wrong to be careful. The machine wasn't wrong to reject anything outside its measurements. But careful and correct weren't the same thing, and somewhere between the two of them sat 6,000 cans, most of which were still good food, sitting in a boy's backyard because nobody had ever built a system patient enough to tell the difference at scale. He started small. He set up 3 stacks along the fence, sound, meaning the dent was cosmetic and the seam was untouched. Uncertain, meaning he wasn't sure, which went into its own pile until he figured out what to do with it. And gone, meaning rust, bulging, a hiss when he pressed the lid, anything with a seam dent, no matter how small, which he carried straight to a pit he dug at the back of the property and never once let himself second-guess. The rule he wrote on the inside cover of his own notebook underneath his father's handwriting was blunt on purpose. If the seam's touched, it's gone. Doesn't matter how good the rest of it looks. No exceptions, not for one can, not ever. Toya used to sit on an overturned bucket after school and watch him work. And one afternoon in May she asked him, in the flat way 9-year-olds ask things, whether all of it was garbage. Some of it, Elias said. Not most of it. Then why'd they throw it away? He thought about that for a long moment, turning a can over in his hands. Because the machine that checks them can't tell the difference between garbage and just ugly. And it's cheaper for them to throw away everything that looks wrong than to pay somebody to look close enough to tell. Are you somebody? I'm trying to be, he said, and went back to sorting. By the middle of June, Elias had sorted through roughly 2,000 of the 6,000 cans, and the sound pile had grown to something over 1,200, stacked in neat rows under a blue tarp he'd bought with the last of the money his mother could spare. He had food. What he did not have was any legal way to get it to anybody who needed it. He found that out the hard way, standing in the parking lot of a small grocery on Route 9, having loaded 40 cans of green beans into the back of his mother's car, with the idea of asking the manager if he'd take them for the shelf at a discount. The manager, a tired man named Rusty who'd known Cornell for years, looked at the cans, looked at Elias, and shook his head before Elias had finished his sentence. Son, I can't put those on a shelf. Not without knowing where they came from, what condition they're really in, whether somebody tested them. If one customer gets sick off a can with my store's name attached to the sale, that's not a mistake I get to walk away from. I'm sorry, I believe you that they're good. Believing you isn't the same as being able to prove it to somebody with a badge. Elias drove home with the trunk still full. That night he sat at the kitchen table with his father's notebook open and understood, for the first time, that sorting the cans correctly had only ever been half the problem. The other half was that nobody in the world had any reason to trust a 16-year-old's word for it, no matter how careful he'd been. The county came looking 2 weeks after that, in the shape of a code enforcement officer named Regina Voss, who parked at the gate, walked the property line without asking permission, and stood a long time in front of the tarp before she said anything. You've got what looks like a small mountain of discarded food product sitting on residential land, she said, clicking her pen the way people in that job always seemed to. That's a pest and sanitation concern, whether or not a single can of it is actually spoiled. I have to write that down. You've got 30 days to have this cleared, sorted, or properly disposed of, or the county sends a crew and bills the cost against the property. It's sorted, Elias said. It's under the top, so it stays dry. Sorted for what? She looked at him, not unkindly, the way a person looks at somebody they've already decided is out of their depth. Sorted doesn't mean legal to distribute, and it doesn't mean I can walk away and pretend I didn't see a pile this size. 30 days. She left him a card with a number on it, the same as every official who'd come through that year seemed to, and Elias stood at the fence for a long while after her truck pulled off the gravel, doing arithmetic in his head that never once came out to enough time. Elias had heard of the Piedmont Regional Food Bank the way most people in a small town hear of things, a name on the side of a truck, a table at the church bazaar once a year. He drove out to their warehouse 2 counties over on a Saturday with a milk crate of 40 cans in the back seat and a page of handwritten notes, and he waited 40 minutes in a lobby before a woman came out to see him. Constance Adair had run that food bank's sorting and safety operation for 19 years. She was in her 60s, built like she'd spent a life on her feet, and she looked at the crate Elias set on her desk with an expression that told him nothing at all. She picked up 1 can, turned it over, looked at the dent, set it down, picked up another. By the 4th can, she'd stopped looking at the cans and started looking at him. You know what I do with donated dented goods that come to me without any paperwork, she said. I throw them out, every single time. Doesn't matter if it's a church group or a grocery chain or the Lord himself standing at my loading dock. If I can't tell you the lot, the date, who checked it, and how, then I can't put it in front of a family and call it food. I'd be gambling with somebody else's dinner, and I don't gamble. I checked every one myself, Elias said, body dents only. Seems untouched, on every can in that crate. I believe that you believe that. She folded her hands on the desk, and for a moment she didn't look at the crate at all. She looked at him, the way a person looks at someone they're deciding whether to spend real time on. That's not the same as this being something I can hand out. You understand the position I'm in. If 1 can in 1,000 makes somebody sick, it's not your name in the paper. It's mine, and it's every family we serve who stops trusting anything with our name on the box after that. She slid the crate back toward him, gently, not as a dismissal exactly, more like handing back something that wasn't hers to keep. I'm not telling you no because you're a kid or because you're wrong. I'm telling you no because you don't have a system yet. You have a sharp eye and a notebook. That's not nothing. It's also not enough. Elias sat with that for a moment. Outside the office window, a forklift beeped somewhere in the warehouse, and a radio was playing low near the loading dock, and none of it seemed to touch the quiet sitting between the 2 of them at that desk. He thought about telling her about his father, about the vision system at the plant that couldn't tell the difference between a dent that mattered and one that didn't, about 33 years of a man's hands being right and nobody writing it down anywhere that counted. He didn't say any of it. It wasn't the kind of thing that changed what she needed from him. What would enough look like? He asked instead. Constance studied him a long moment before she answered. Most people who got that answer from her, she'd tell him later, on a different afternoon, months down the road, either got angry. The way people get angry when a door they expected to walk through turns out to be locked, or they thanked her for her time and never came back, filing her no away as the end of the conversation instead of the start of a harder one. He hadn't done either. He'd asked a real question, and then he'd waited, the way his father used to wait at the kitchen table for a number to add up, patient in a way most 16-year-olds she'd met had no reason to be. Written protocol, she said, and she counted it off on her fingers, one at a time, the way she'd clearly explained this before to people who never came back to hear the rest of it. Every category of damage defined, in writing, not just carried around in your head, where it can shift a little depending on how tired you are that day. A rule for what happens to each category, and I mean a rule with no soft edges in it, nothing a tired person on a long afternoon could talk themselves into bending. Because that's when mistakes happen, not on the good days. On the day you've sorted 800 cans since sunup and your judgment's worn thin, and something borderline comes across the table, and you're inclined to give it the benefit of the doubt because you want to go home. She held up a second finger before he could respond. Batch and lot tracking, she went on. Every can you clear needs to trace back to a specific date, a specific truckload, a specific decision you made about it. Because if something ever does go wrong, and I want you to plan as if it will someday, no matter how careful you are, the first question anybody asks isn't whether you're a good person. It's whether you can tell them exactly which cans were touched and which ones weren't. If your answer to that is, I think it was sometime in the summer, you don't have a business. You have a liability with a friendly face on it. She held up a third finger, and here she slowed down, like this was the part she most wanted him to actually hear. And somewhere, along the way, real verification. Lab testing, or a health department official willing to put their own name on a letter saying they watched your process and it holds up. Because right now, everything you've told me today rests entirely on your word. And I believe you. I want to be clear about that. I'm not sitting here thinking you're lying to me or exaggerating what you've done out there. But belief isn't a food safety standard, and it can't be, not for me, not for anybody in this line of work. Your word and my liability are not the same size, not even close, and until somebody outside your own family can vouch for your method the same way they'd vouch for a licensed processor, I can't put a single one of these cans in front of a family and call it food. Not because you're wrong. Because I'd be gambling, and I already told you, I don't gamble with somebody else's dinner. She sat back, and for the first time since he'd walked in, something in her face softened, just slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to it. You came in here with a crate and a notebook, and most kids your age wouldn't have come at all. That counts for something with me. It just doesn't count for enough yet. Go build the part that's missing and come back when you have it, and I promise you, I will look at it seriously. How do I get that? Slowly, Constance said. And by getting told, know a lot more before anybody tells you yes. It took him most of the summer. He wrote the protocol first, sitting at the kitchen table most nights after Toya was asleep, his father's notebook open beside his own. Category 1, body dent only, seam and rim untouched, no rust, lid presses firm with no give, sound cleared for use. Category 2, any dent within a half-inch of the seam, any rust past surface discoloration, any lid that gives or clicks under thumb pressure. Destroyed on sight, no second look, no matter how good the rest of the can appeared. Category 3, anything he genuinely couldn't decide inside 30 seconds. Set aside for a second check the next morning with a clear head, and if still uncertain, treated as Category 2. He built a testing station out of a folding table and a bathroom scale, learned to weigh cans against a known good sample to catch slow leaks that didn't show any outside sign, and started logging every batch by the date and the truckload it came off of, the same numbering system his father had used for line reports for 30 years without ever once being trusted to make the call himself. He drove to the county extension office and asked, flat out, if anyone there could tell him whether his method held up. A food safety specialist named Harlan Spate came out to the lot twice that July, watched him sort 200 cans without saying much, and on the second visit finally spoke. Your instincts are better than they've got any right to be for somebody who's never had a class in this, Harlan said, but instinct isn't a certificate. I can get you into a food handler safety course over in Macon, and I can put you in touch with a lab that'll run a sample batch for less than you'd think. And if both of those come back clean, I'll write you a letter myself saying I watched you work, and I believe your process holds. Elias took the course in August, paid for the lab test with money his mother had been saving toward the tax bill, which she handed over without being asked and without saying a word about it, and the results came back clean on every can in the sample batch he'd cleared. Harlan wrote the letter. He drove it out to Constance Adair himself, along with his written protocol and 3 months of batch logs in a binder his mother had bought him at the dollar store. She read the whole binder at her desk while he sat across from her, saying nothing, the way his father used to sit in rooms where other people held the deciding vote. When she finished, she closed it and looked at him for a long moment. "Well," she said, "now you've got something I can actually put my name behind." She named a starting number, small, cautious. 200 cans a month, tracked, logged, delivered on a schedule, subject to her own spot checks whenever she felt like showing up unannounced. It was not the food pantry contract yet. It was the first door, cracked open a few inches, and Elias walked out of that warehouse into the parking lot and sat in his mother's car for a full minute before he let himself feel anything about it. The trouble that nearly ended it came from a direction nobody in the Briggs family had ever thought to watch. A regional surplus distributor named Otis Kell had for years run a quiet arrangement with several plants in the area, including Halsey Brothers, buying up reject and discontinued stock cheap, and reselling it to discount grocers and dollar stores at a healthy markup. It was not a large business, but it was steady, and it depended entirely on nobody looking too closely at where damaged goods actually ended up or what happened to them. Elias' operation, small as it was, had started drawing exactly that kind of attention. Constance Adair had mentioned him at a regional food bank meeting that fall, praising the protocol, and word had traveled the way it does in small industries, from one warehouse manager to another, until it reached a man who did not like the idea of a 16-year-old, proving that a lot of what got labeled unsellable was, with a little patience, still perfectly good, and worth exactly nothing to a man whose whole business depended on the opposite being believed. The complaint arrived at the county health department in October. It named a family in the next county over who claimed to have fallen ill after eating from a can of green beans that had, according to the label, come through the Piedmont Regional Food Bank's fall distribution, the same distribution that had included the first batch of 200 cans Elias had ever delivered. Nobody could later prove where the original tip came from. But the timing and the fact that a competing surplus buyer had lost a standing arrangement with Halsey Brothers that same month once, the plant started asking harder questions about where its own rejects were going, sat in Elias' mind for a long time afterward as more than a coincidence. An inspector named Priscilla Nembhard came out to the Briggs lot on a gray Tuesday with a folder already half full. She was professional, careful, and entirely unwilling to take his word for anything, which was, he understood even as it happened, exactly her job. A family reported gastrointestinal illness consistent with possible foodborne contamination, and the product they say caused it traces back to a batch with your lot number on it, she said. I need your records, I need samples, and I need to understand your process from the ground up. If your sorting missed something, people need to know that today, not next month. He gave her everything: the binder, the batch logs, the folding table, the notebook. She spent 4 hours walking the operation, testing his method against his own claims, and left without telling him what she thought. Constance Adair pulled every can from that batch off her shelves before Elias had even gotten home. She did not raise her voice when she called him. She simply said the distribution was suspended pending the investigation, and that he should understand this was not personal, and that it would look worse, not better, if he tried to argue his way past it. The story reached Ellerby inside of 3 days. A post went up in a local community group from an account nobody could trace back to a real name, naming the Briggs lot and the words food poisoning in the same sentence. And by the end of that week, people who had never once driven past that fence line were saying, with total confidence, that the Briggs boy had made somebody sick trying to sell them garbage. Revenue, such as it was, went to nothing. Harlan Spate's phone stopped ringing back. Rusty at the grocery store, who'd never bought a single can from him but had let him leave flyers by the register, took the flyers down without being asked. Yvonne sat Elias down at the kitchen table that week and told him gently that if this went past the tax deadline in the spring, they might have to talk about selling the lot after all. Taxes settled, debt cleared. The whole question finally closed one way instead of hanging over them for another year. She said it the way a tired woman says a thing she doesn't want to be true. Elias didn't argue with her. There was nothing yet to argue with. The thing that saved him was a habit Constance Adair had drilled into him from the very first meeting, a rule he'd followed without ever once skipping it, even on the busiest weeks. Every batch he sorted, he kept back 3 cans in a labeled box in the shed, untouched, dated, matched to the batch number, in case anybody ever needed to check his work against the actual product instead of his word about it. When Priscilla Nembhard asked, on her second visit, whether any of the original batch still existed anywhere outside what had already been distributed, Elias walked her straight to the shed and handed her the box. The lab results came back 11 days later. Every can from that retained sample tested clean. No contamination, no seal failure, nothing above any threshold that would explain what the family had reported. Nembhard, to her credit, didn't stop there. She went back through the family's own account of what else they'd eaten that week and found, 3 days before the reported illness, a separate case of undercooked poultry from an entirely unrelated source, a fact the family hadn't thought to mention because it hadn't occurred to them it mattered. The timeline fit that far better than it fit a can of green beans that had passed every test run against it. The complaint was closed in November, cleared, no fault found. But Nembhard's sweep of the shed had turned up one more thing, and Elias never once left it out afterward when he told the story. A single retained sample from a smaller batch in September, made during a stretch of unusually warm, humid weather, had come back with early signs of internal rust starting at the seam from the inside, invisible from outside the can, the kind of failure his outside checks alone would never have caught if it had gone out instead of getting held back. It hadn't gone out, nobody had ever received it. But it was there, sitting in his own shed, closer to a real mistake than his careful eyes alone had ever let him see. Nembhard showed him the number on the lab sheet herself. She'd driven back out on a Wednesday, unannounced, and found him in the shed rechecking a batch he'd already cleared twice, which she noted, without comment, in the same small book she carried everywhere. "You didn't do what they said you did," she told him, setting the sheet flat on the folding table between them. "But you got lucky on this one, not careful. There's a difference, and I want you to sit with that difference before you go back to work, because luck runs out and careful doesn't." Elias looked at the number for a long time. It wasn't a scary number. That was the part that stayed with him longest, driving her words home harder than a disaster would have. Nothing had happened. Nobody had gotten sick off that batch, nobody ever would, because it had never left the shed. But the number was moving in a direction that, given one more warm week, one more distracted afternoon, would have stopped being harmless. He had caught it by accident, not by design, and the difference between those two things was the whole of what she was asking him to understand. "How do I make it not luck next time?" he asked. "You build something that doesn't need you to be paying attention every single second," she said, "because you won't be, nobody is. Not your father wasn't, not the folks running that vision system at the plant weren't either, not really. They just built a machine to be tired for them instead of a person. You need your own version of that. Something dumber than you, honestly, that catches what you miss on your worst day, not your best one. She left him with that and drove off, and Elias sat in the shed a long while after her taillights disappeared down the gravel, turning the lab sheet over in his hands the way his father used to turn a can, checking it from every side before he trusted what his eyes had already told him. He reopened in December, and he didn't reopen the same way. The failure hadn't been in his sorting eye. His eye, if anything, had been the one part of the whole operation that had never actually failed. What had failed was the assumption sitting underneath it, the quiet belief that a careful person checking carefully was, by itself, a system. It wasn't. It was a habit, and habits bent when a person was tired or cold or thinking about a tax bill instead of a can. And Elias had been all three of those things more days that year than he'd ever admitted to his mother. So he built a second layer, one that didn't care how he felt on a given afternoon, one that would catch a mistake even on the day his attention was somewhere else entirely. The first piece was a pressure gauge, a simple handheld thing that could read whether a can had lost even the smallest amount of internal vacuum, the kind of slow leak that gave no outside sign at all, no rust, no dent, nothing his hands or his eyes had ever been trained to feel. It cost less than he expected. His mother didn't blink at the price once he explained, in his father's flat, unemotional way, exactly what it had caught in testing, 3 cans out of 100 that had looked perfect and weren't. The second piece was a rule, written down and taped inside the shed door where he'd see it every morning before he touched a single can. Any batch collected during a stretch of humidity above a set line got an automatic extra week of holding and rechecking before it went anywhere, no matter who was waiting on it, no matter how good it looked on day one. Constance Adair had waited on deliveries before. She could wait again. A family eating a week later was a far smaller cost than a family eating something that hadn't finished proving itself safe. The third piece was more retained samples, 5 per batch now instead of 3, because Nemhard's visit had taught him that the difference between an accusation that cleared him and one that didn't had come down to a handful of cans sitting in a box he'd almost not bothered keeping. And the fourth piece was the notebook by the door, hung on its own nail right beside his father's, where he logged temperature and humidity by hand, twice a day, every day, because Harlan Spate had told him plainly that the weather was the one variable he'd never once written down in a whole year of careful record-keeping. And it was exactly the kind of thing that slipped past people who'd started trusting themselves a little too much. He wrote the first entry in that new notebook on a cold morning in early December, his breath showing in the shed light, Toya's chalk numbers from the old bucket log still visible on the wall behind him where nobody had bothered to erase them. He wrote the date, the temperature, the humidity, and underneath it, in the same cramped hand his father had used for 33 years at the other end of this exact problem, one line meant only for himself. Being right once isn't a system. Build the thing that's right even when you're not paying attention. Then he went back to work. Constance tested 3 fresh batches before she'd take him back, same as she'd have done for anyone. "You're going to think I'm punishing you," she said. "I don't," Elias said. "Good. Because I do the exact same thing to a company 40 years older than you, and that's the whole point of it." The first month back was quiet in a way that hurt worse than the accusation had. People who'd never met him were still repeating a story that had already been proven wrong, because a correction never travels as fast or as far as the accusation did. Constance told him it would take a season to fully turn around, and mostly she was right. The turn, when it finally came, arrived from a direction nobody expected. Dale Pruitt had spent the better part of a year telling the crew at Halsey Brothers that the Briggs boys' little operation was a headache waiting to happen, right up until a quiet internal audit that winter found that the plant's landfill costs for rejected cans had dropped by nearly 40% since Elias had started taking a steady share of the reject stream off their hands, cans that would otherwise have cost the company money by the ton to bury. More than that, word had started circulating in food safety circles across 3 counties that a small operation out of Ellerby had built one of the more rigorous informal sorting protocols anybody had seen from an outfit that size, and that the Piedmont Regional Food Bank was quietly using it as a case study for other small donors. The plant manager, a careful man named Sheldon Voss, who had never once set foot on the Briggs lot in a year and a half of trucks going back and forth, drove out himself on a Thursday in February. He stood at the fence a while, looking at the sorting tables, the retain sample shed, the humidity log hanging on its nail, before he said anything. "I'll be straight with you," he said. "We've been treating this like we were doing your family a favor by dumping our problem on your land. I've come around to thinking it's closer to the other way." He glanced at Dale Prout, who'd driven him out and was standing a few feet back, saying nothing at all. "I'd like to make this formal, a standing agreement. We route our body dent rejects through your sort, on a schedule, with our own inspector able to spot-check your logs whenever they want, and in exchange, we pay you a fee per unit instead of you taking it for free." Elias didn't answer right away. He thought about his father's notebook, and the line about a machine that never got tired and never got to be right on its own terms, and he thought about Constance Adair telling him, months earlier, that his word and her liability weren't the same size. "I want it in writing," Elias said. "Same protocol I already run. No exceptions for a rush order, no exceptions when the audit's inconvenient. And I want the food bank named directly in the agreement, not just me. Whatever comes off your rejects that passes goes to them first at a fixed price before anything else." Sheldon Voss studied him a moment, the way people had been studying Elias all year, trying to work out how a teenager had arrived at terms a company lawyer would have taken a week to draft. "Done," he said, and put his hand out. The contract was signed the following month. A real document, Halsey Brothers Canning Company on one line, the Piedmont Regional Food Bank on another, and Elias' own operation, which he'd started calling Briggs Sort and Supply mostly because Toya had insisted it needed a name, listed between them. Constance Adair called him the week it was finalized. "You know what this means," she said. 4 counties are about to be eating better because a machine at a cannery couldn't tell the difference between ugly and dangerous, and a 16-year-old could. 2 years on, Briggs Sort and Supply runs out of a proper cinderblock building on the same 4 acres, built with the first real money the contract brought in. Concrete floor, real ventilation, a row of stainless tables that would have made Cornell Briggs stop talking mid-sentence the first time he saw them. Elias is 18 now. He still checks every uncertain can himself before it goes to the second table, because he learned the hard way that the rule matters more than the confidence behind it. He still keeps 5 retained samples per batch. Still logs the weather twice a day. Still writes the date in the same cramped hand his father used for 33 years on a different kind of line, at a different end of the same problem. Toya is 11. She runs the batch log now on an actual clipboard instead of a bucket, and she has told her brother, more than once, in front of the 2 part-time employees they've hired since, that he still rounds numbers when he's tired, and she catches it every time. Yvonne paid the back taxes the same month the contract was signed. In full, standing at the county window with the receipt shaking slightly in her hand, not from feeling, she told Elias later, just from 12 years on a laundry room floor. The pile in the yard is gone now, but the pit at the back of the property is still there, marked off with its own fence. Elias has never once let a can go into it without being certain, because certain, his father's notebook said in the end, in handwriting Elias still reads over some nights when the shop is quiet, is the only thing a person in this line of work is ever actually selling. Dale Prout still rides out with the delivery some Thursdays. He has never once brought up what he said into that radio on the first morning, and Elias has never once brought it up either. The contract renewal hangs framed on the shop wall instead, next to a photograph of Cornell Briggs in his work coveralls. That, more than any conversation either of them could have had, is the whole of what needed saying between them. Somewhere right now, another plant is filling another warehouse with cans a machine has decided are worthless. Most of that food will end up buried before the year is out, because nobody's standing near. It will take the time to look close enough to tell ugly apart from dangerous. Every once in a while, somebody does. If this story reminded you that the world throws away more good things than it means to, just because it's in too much of a hurry to look twice, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments what town you're watching from. There's another story like this one coming soon.